really
Oh,
good.
okay. Yeah, we can meet when you are back. It might be
Yeah,
good to
yeah.
have a meeting person, Kiki, to discuss this. So
Yeah, we
after
can
you are
do.
back,
Do you come to
because I have
UCL?
several candidates. Sorry?
Adriano, are we live on YouTube now?
Yeah, I started now.
Oh, okay.
That's fine. That's fine. Just I can cut it afterwards. I can cut it afterwards, so it's okay.
Yeah, we can meet when you are back.
Yeah.
Person, Kiki, to discuss. I hear my voice. So
Yeah, we
after
can
you are back.
Do you come to UCL? Now YouTube can hear us talking about meeting. Adriano.
It was funny because like there's a delay, right? So I saw you both speaking when I was through the YouTube open, so it's fine. Yeah. I think now it's finally broadcasting there. Let's just wait a little bit, but it's fine. I can cut it afterwards, so don't mind about it. I don't think there's still a few viewers. There's 6 people watching now. 7. Yeah, it's increasing. Just wait, usually like 2 minutes, and then we start. Is that fine? Yeah, excellent. Yeah, very excited now. Like we have a proper webcam, got a proper microphone. I'm feeling like almost starting a Joe Rogan podcast. My bedroom.
Please don't.
Yeah, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's start. So hello, everybody. Welcome to the monthly edition of UCL AI Insights. I'm your host, Adriano Koshiyama, a research fellow here at the UCL Computer Science Department. Taking place monthly, the series will focus on a range of topics and current debates in the fields of artificial intelligence, or AI. Each event will provide detailed insight into a different aspect of AI technologies and will incorporate the views of several leading experts. All of the events will be streamed live on the UCL AI Center's YouTube channel with the opportunity for you viewers to put the questions to the panel. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel and Twitter page for future events. So in this series, we will be exploring a key risk when developing and deploying AI technologies. Algorithm bias and discrimination, or AI fairness, as some would prefer, is not only an emerging area of research, but a historical reckoning about what the data reflects, as well as the machine learning models, as well as the way machine learning models are being developed and to what purpose they are being used. So the second event on this series is entitled AI Insight Series, is entitled Bias in AI, Perspectives from Research and Industry. To talk about this topic, the speakers composed our panel today are Dr. Franziska Leutner from Harryville and also from UCL. Kiki is, as we like lovely to call her, Kiki is a business psychologist and data scientist at University College London. She's Director of Assessment and Innovation Harryville, where she develops innovative, data-driven assessments that are fair and psychometrically valid. Her academic work is published in peer-reviewed journals, including work on the intersection of machine learning and psychometrics. She's an expert in innovative psychometric assessment, personality theory, and behavior analytics. Welcome, Kiki. Welcome,
Hi,
Kiki.
great to be here.
Another invited is Professor Emine Umays from Computer Science UCL and also from Human Loop, we should say. Emine is a professor and Turing Fellow at UCL, Department of Computer Science. She also works as an Amazon scholar for Amazon. Her research interests lie in the areas of information retrieval, data mining, and applications of machine learning, probability, and statistics. Welcome, Emine.
Thank you. Great to be here as well.
Excellent. Yeah. So to start the whole event, I would just ask Kiki to do her presentation first, and then we're gonna have a mini Q&A based on that. Thank you, Dad.
Awesome. Thank you, Adriano. Just setting up my screen share. All right, I hope you can see that fine. So thank you for having me. I spent about 10 minutes talking a little bit about what I do and how that's informed my thinking about ethics in machine learning and AI. And I work in this very interesting area in psychometrics and assessments applied in the assessment industry, where we've been using algorithms for quite a long time, but they weren't AI-based algorithms. But because we've been using algorithms for such a long time to make decisions about people, we've developed some guidelines and regulations. And now combining that with artificial intelligence, we come up with some interesting insights. But yeah, let me start by telling you about what I do. So fundamentally, I look at the question of how we can predict what someone is going to do next, or how we can understand who someone is. And that's important, say, if we look at the selection context. So if I want to hire someone and I don't know who they are, how can I tell who's most likely to perform well at a job? But it's also important in other areas like marketing. How can I tell who is most likely to be interested in my product? In the world of dating or matchmaking, how can I tell who's a good fit for me? In lots of other areas. So every time we want to predict human behavior, we typically want to understand how someone's different from everyone else. And in psychology, that area of research is called individual differences. And so unlike many other areas of psychology where we want to understand people in general, individual differences psychology is at that intersection where we acknowledge that people are generally similar, but there are also some differences between individuals. And that's exactly what we're interested in for the purposes I mentioned before. And then the field that I work in particular is psychometric assessments. And again, they can be used in marketing or in other areas, but where I've spent the last 3 years focusing my work on, or 3 to 5 years, is in selection. So selecting people for work, figuring out if they're a good fit for that job, figuring out who's most likely to perform well. And psychometrics have undergone a really interesting transformation. So maybe 10 years ago, everything was still very much based on pen and paper assessments. Many of you probably have done a test like that, where you get a bunch of questions like, I like to talk to strangers at parties, or my desk is always tidy, and you kind of answer on a 1 to 5 format. And they've been around since really the inception of those tests in the 1920s. And they were computerized to some degree, but there wasn't really much that was different about them. But then maybe in the last 5 to 10 years, we've started seeing technology really come into this. So both in terms of the assessment format, we're seeing game-based assessments emerge, where instead of boring questions, you have more interactive tasks that you go through. But then also in terms of the data sources that we can look at. So there's a lot of work in natural language processing and in looking at digital traces, like what you do on social media, to kind of disentangle and figure out your personality from those behavioral traces. And there's been some really interesting research that's come out, and some of that is being applied in industry now as well, so that we can assess personality, not just from those boring tests, but also from looking at what someone has written or what someone has said or how they've behaved online. And typically what we look at when we say we look at individual differences in personality are things that are associated with job performance. And you really should not underestimate the power of those assessments. There's been research for decades and decades now looking at the connection between someone's personality or intelligence and their job performance. And we see that we can really distinguish high and low performers based on their cognitive ability and conscientiousness. So in particular, conscientiousness, which is one personality trait. So it's really worthwhile looking at those individual differences to make some predictions about someone's job performance in this particular instance. And we have lots of research backing up that connection and showing that there's strong correlations between specific personality traits and cognitive ability and job performance. Typically, companies use those kinds of tests because A, there's good evidence that they work, and B, and this sometimes gets lost, in a scenario where they have lots and lots of applicants. So of course, an extensive job interview process that's well structured with well-trained evaluators and experienced hiring managers is a very good way of deciding whether someone's a good job fit or not. But in many applied scenarios, you have tens and thousands of applicants and you just don't have the time and resources to put everyone through that process. And that's where assessments and algorithms often come in, so that you can kind of hedge your bets, that you can use your resources to manually look at people in the best way possible. So this is a typical example where you might have 10,000 applicants and then you use a series of cognitive ability or personality assessments to dwindle that down to a manageable number of hundreds of applicants that you then interview or put through an assessment center. And so the idea is that research tells us that this works in terms of getting people through your funnel that are most likely to perform well, but it also helps maintain fairness, right? So we're looking at ethics in algorithms and a criticism in terms of bias. We have lots of research with these personality and intelligence assessments in the selection context, looking at the fairness of those algorithms. And we can see that some of the personality tests, in particular, like conscientiousness, that has such a good connection to job performance, has very little group differences when we look at different age, gender, and ethnicity. Other tests don't do so well, like traditional cognitive ability tests. But also assessment centers don't do so well in terms of fairness. But we have this research that's summarized in this slide. We have this available because we've been using assessments and these kind of algorithms in selection for so long, and researchers have developed frameworks to talk about it. And we also have legal guidance. And that's because the assessments have been around for so long. So this is where it becomes really interesting, I think, for AI ethics, because the assessments we use in selection typically have very simplistic algorithms, like this is what you answered to question 1 and we add it all up, and the algorithm is not very sophisticated, but that doesn't make much of a difference in terms of how it gets regulated and how we think about the algorithm working. And so the standards that have come out with these assessments is that we look at both practical and statistical tests to determine group differences in scores. So if I develop an assessment or a scoring algorithm, and increasingly those can be AI-based too, if we look at digital traces, then I need to show practically and statistically how big the differences between groups are. And we have a thing called the 4/5 rule, which is a practical test, and I think it's quite intuitive. And it sort of says that you have to compare the selection rates for, say, gender. So for men and women, you compare how many would pass your assessment or pass your algorithm. And then you look at the difference between that rate. And if, say, out of 100 male applicants, you select 100, and out of 100 female applicants, you select 85, that would be considered a difference, but it's still manageable, let's say, and acceptable. But if it's less than 80, so less than 4/5, then it would not be acceptable. So that's kind of the intuitive guideline. but it describes that thinking that you shouldn't have massive differences in how candidates of different groups do in your algorithm. And then we test that with statistical tests as well to see if there are significant group differences. And we test that along age, gender, ethnicity, and typically all the things that we can feasibly get data on. So A, we can measure them or ask people about it, and B, we have enough people in each group to test it. It's obviously not possible for every difference. And in the United States in particular, there's some stringent regulation, and it's very well adhered to because it has huge legal implications. So if you don't meet these standards and you use an assessment algorithm, you can easily get sued. So they're pretty well followed and implemented. And here's an example of the different statistical tests we would look at. So if we create an algorithm measuring, for example, your agreeableness or your conscientiousness personality trait, then we would look at how many in each group pass, what their passing rate is, their adverse impact, and then also statistical differences between the groups. And you have to analyze any algorithm that you use in selection in this way. So what we're seeing is that we're in selection really focused on, or in psychometrics, we're really focused on the outcomes, right? And it makes, I think, intuitive sense to say if I use a hurdle that you have to get over to apply for a job, then that hurdle shouldn't, leave out disproportionately more people from a certain group. So we're focused on the outcomes, really. I think in the AI ethics community, there's also a lot of work around accuracy. So looking at the different levels of accuracy of certain algorithms for different groups. And I think Emina will talk about this in a bit more detail. But it makes sense for that applied context because you're developing an algorithm often to generate data about a person. And so you want to make sure that that's similarly accurate for the different groups. But so ultimately, what I think we need to do is bring those two approaches together, and an algorithm that's thoroughly assessed for adverse impact or for fairness should look at both of those aspects, right? So you want to make sure that certain groups don't score very differently from other groups, and then you also want to make sure that their accuracy is similar. And in particular, some of the algorithms that are used in selection now kind of fall into both categories. So they make use of AI algorithms that can have differential accuracy, and then they also make decisions about people using that data. So you can have both layers happening at the same time. So you might use a face recognition or a transcription algorithm that has accuracy that might differ between groups, and then you use that data to make a selection algorithm to predict job performance, and that can again have different outcomes for different groups. So it's a complex problem to look at, and we need to look at it from different layers, let's say. So I hope that was a good overview of why we use algorithms in selection. The main point is that there is this industry within HR that draws on individual differences theory, and where we've developed really good regulatory guidelines on how to look at algorithms. And I think those guidelines should be ported over into other areas, really any area where we're looking at human data and trying to predict human behavior. But then we also need to bring in the work around accuracy that's coming more from the AI ethics field to make sure that algorithms are fair for people from different groups. And yeah, thank you. I think Emina will now talk more about the AI side of things.
Yeah, can you just stop sharing, Kiki, for a while? So we just we just have let's just have a quick Q&A, and then we do M&A afterwards. So just a question from myself. It feels to me that it's becoming like there are, maybe I'm wrong, which is not typically new, but it feels to me that there are emerging some kind of no-go zones for machine learning development. Mm-hmm. So like there are some areas where you just don't go. So one of them is becoming like I can give an example, like policing, using machine learning to score people and try to use that for improving police services. Like no one is doing that much anymore. Mm-hmm. just because they feel that the data is not good, or the way people are developing things and the end purpose are not okay. So like there are, every time there is this touch with some social issue, it's becoming like, let's not do it, let's just stop it. How do you see like assessments and recruitment? Is it, do you feel there's like a trend emerging on that direction, or like kind of a pushback on that direction, or no, it's still okay?
It's a very interesting question, actually, because I follow those kind of discussions. And I think, for example, what's happened with companies stopping their face recognition algorithms, it's a very positive move because they've seen all the problems it's created. And especially in policing, the use is so controversial and so problematic. At the same time, I think, oh gosh, I hope this does not happen to assessments in selection. But I think it's fundamentally a very different area because assessments and selection have been so well regulated. I mean, there's more we can do, but they have been regulated to a certain degree. And there is research showing that they are, compared to other selection methods, they are fairer, right? So we know that a more structured selection process brings in more fairness and typically helps minority candidates compared to an unstructured process. So it's kind of this argument of, it's a very biased world, and the assessments, even though they contain some bias, we do everything we can to minimize that bias. And then by using that in a structured way, overall in the process, you're reducing bias. So it's not, you can't look at the algorithm just in isolation. You have to also look at the area where it's being applied into and what the status quo is in that area at the moment. And that sometimes can be difficult to figure out. But it's another layer that I think you have to pay attention to. And in assessments in particular, I think the push should be more to have tighter regulation, let's say. So instead of allowing a 4/5 rule, maybe that has to be tighter. But assessments overall increase the fairness of selection processes. So it would be a shame not to use them,
yeah.
I have a question as well. So Kiki, you talked about statistical parity and accuracy, and from AI point of view, what happens usually is the more you try to optimize for fairness, you may have to give up on overall accuracy of the algorithm. So that's been one trade-off, and there's a lot of work on trying to overcome this problem. But I think this had an effect overall. Partially, there are more reasons for that, but some companies try to avoid looking into bias, for example. Although it's a big problem for all of them, everyone keeps talking about bias in AI. It's something that they are afraid also to touch on, because once they advertise, once people know that their results are biased, then it becomes a problem for them. How do you see, you work on in the recruitment domain, how do you see this problem being solved? Do you think in the domain of recruitment, people do look into bias more? I know people are becoming more and more aware of the problem, but do you think right now where we are regarding this is a good trajectory? And what do you think can be done to make industry more focused on this problem and make sure that their algorithms are fairer?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And it's an important one. So I think, again, selection is a bit of a unique area because at least at the outcome level, we have to report how biased the assessment is. So of course, you don't want to publish an assessment that's biased, but then you work on it until it's not. So at least in that area, we have to publish it. In terms of the accuracy of maybe algorithms that feed into the assessment, that regulation doesn't exist, so we don't have to publish it. And then absolutely, you're right. I think if it wasn't for the work of Joy at MIT, for example, we wouldn't have that good data of seeing, this is how Microsoft's transcription or face recognition algorithms work versus other companies. So that absolutely, I think, has to become a standard so that you don't get penalized for being the only provider that does it. But then we've also, in assessments in particular, it's been very interesting because we've started doing these mitigations on our scoring algorithms to enhance the fairness of assessments, so to make sure that they are as unbiased as possible. And we found that even if we trade off very little of the accuracy, it really enhances the assessments. And that's the case even if you have a somewhat biased training data set. So this assumption I think that's gained popularity, which is a very important realization and a good point to make, that if you put biased data in, the output would be biased. That's only true to a certain extent, because we can develop methodologies to make the outcome less biased, even if the input data is ultimately biased. So that's been an interesting learning experience. But I think in assessments, we're in a unique position where there's some need to publish, so everyone has to do it. And that probably needs to be broadened to other areas as well, yeah.
Yep, just before I go to the questions that the members of the audience has put forward, just want to hear you, Kiki, about this, and that's something I've been exploring this a lot with Emory in some of the work we've been doing, which is one thing that you are pointing out, which is the even though the algorithms or the AI or whatever it is not still 100% fair or unbiased, at least it's better than the status quo.
Yeah.
So there was at least a push for some improvement. So in a way, automation is improving things a bit, and it is also uncovering or making transparent a lot of the problems that were there and we would be discussing. So in that front, what would be kind of the most, if you had to show like a number or a statistic or something just to flag to them and say, look, things were like this, and now even though they're not 100%, at least they are better than before. What would be the contrast, or what would be the comparison that we could make just to make it stronger?
I mean, this is even philosophically, it's a very interesting argument to make, right? It's biased, but it's not as bad as what came before. And I think it's a very tempting argument, but it also can't make us lazy. So even if the situation is horrible now, if we then introduce something that's a little bit less horrible, that's still bad. So I think adhering to and agreeing on a basic standard for fairness, like we can accept a 4/5 in differences of selection rates, or we can accept, you know, up to this amount of, I don't know, difference between group scores. That's important as a minimum, right? And then you also want to show that you're not making the situation worse, right? So if we agree on that minimum, but we replace a process that now is fairer with an algorithm just because it's cheaper, for example, that's a much worse than replacing an algorithm that's at least minimally fair and using that to replace a process that's now hugely unfair. And some of the things that you can look at is either in the research literature, there's comparisons of different selection methods that we can look at. So you would say, okay, what could I do? I could do an interview, I could do a structured interview, I could do an assessment, and then look at group differences in performance along all of those. That's a very difficult thing to do in terms of data collection. In the applied context, what you can often do is you can say, okay, this company ran a recruitment round last year for graduates. They typically get 10,000 applicants, and they ended up with, 2% women in their recruitment round, for example, right? Which would be terrible. And then the next year they use assessments and they end up with 20 or 30% women. Then that could be one metric to look at. So the diversity of your recruited cohorts and how it changes year on year. So obviously it's more of an observational study because other things can change through the year, but you can look at those kind of real outcomes in terms of your recruitment results.
Yep. I'm just going to put a question from the audience. There's quite a few of them, but I'm just going to pick one that I find interesting. It's less about, it's related, I guess. So the question is, can individual assume one of several personalities? That's the typical question, right? That you probably, one for the office and one for social media. Yes. And is there a risk of misassessing suitability for office job if using online behavior, for instance?
Yeah, so first of all, it's very interesting. When I started off doing research in this area, there was this huge debate about, can we use social media at all in research? Like people just have fake personalities. And there were a lot of studies into it. And people tend to show us personality that's somewhat similar to what they are in real life. So either what they rate themselves or what their friends rate themselves. So there is some congruency between who you portray to be online and who you actually are. And I think the same is true at work. But of course, you act differently at work than you would at home. But still, if you're a very conscientious person, you probably have a very tidy home and you have a very tidy desk. Rarely would you meet a person that has a overly tidy desk and then you come to their house and it's an absolute mess. So that's kind of the idea with personality. But you can also create tests that kind of account for that a little bit. So you would say, at work, would you talk to your colleagues, or you can kind of try and assess behaviors that are more related to the workplace directly. But yeah, there is, of course, variance in individuals between situations and different environments, even different friendship groups. You can of course adapt your behavior. But when we compare you to the most extreme, or when we compare you to other people, we can still see consistently what your personality typically is.
Interesting. Yeah. I just want to ask a final question before we go to Emily. But there's a lot of other questions. The reason why I'm not asking them now is because I think applies to both. So I'm going to put them in the end so both can also reply. But I know one question that you may be interested to reply is, Kiki, if you could improve regulation in one way, what would you change? So based on the 4/5 rule and all these metrics that they have in the US particularly, what would be the key thing that you would like to enforce?
Yeah, very good. Very good question. So I think we could look at increasing how strict it is. So is 4/5 really what we're willing to accept? And I think in particular, we need more context on that. So if I have one group that consistently is just above 4/5 on all the tests, then overall my assessment process probably should somehow be changed. But the way the regulation is applied at the moment, it's really per assessment. So there could be a more holistic look at that, right? Or if it's always women that do worse on all of the tests that you have, that's probably not right. But if you have 5 tests and women do better on 2 and men do better on 3, so it's kind of looking at it a bit more holistically. And then the second thing is looking at accuracy. So when you do bring in algorithms and you bring in data sources where they could be affected by accuracy, then you would have to report that as well, which is kind of a very new thing, but I think that should be included. And then we should include some sort of guidance on what's acceptable for accuracy, because there will be differences and that is fine, but there should be a minimum guidance similar to the 4/5 for that as well.
Would you also look at intersections between,
Okay, so that's a very good question, but I think in practice it just becomes so messy that it's very difficult to uphold. But the sentiment is the same as the first point I made, right? That if consistently women perform worse and consistently one particular ethnic group performs worse on all of the assessment, then we need to rethink really how our assessments are designed, and that we need to counter it somehow. Yeah,
excellent. Thanks, Kiki. Now I'm going to move to Emine for her presentation, and then also Q&A afterwards.
Okay, can you all see my screen?
Okay. Yes, perfect. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll be talking about bias in social media and the web, which is the main focus area of my research group at UCL. So as you know, in the web, we use the web to mainly access information, to get the news and to learn about the world, which could affect our decision making, for example. And the web could contain some inaccurate and misleading or potentially fake information. And this information has the potential to have a big effect in our everyday lives and in our decision making. So it could have a big effect in the society as a whole. And that's why we mainly focus on how this information in the web, how biased is this information in the web is, and how can we fix this bias. So these are the 2 main research questions that we try to ask in my research group. So I try to give you some overview of some of the problems that we currently work on before I start talking about the details. So one line of research that we focus on is looking into just bias separately, completely ignoring the relationship between misinformation and bias. And so in context of bias, one of the main problems is how do you evaluate bias? And this becomes a particularly difficult problem in context of rank lists. Even in classification, it's an unsolved problem. But when you deal with rank list of results, such as results presented in search engines, how do you measure, how do you evaluate bias? And another line of work that we do is, let's assume that you have the techniques to measure bias. How do you deal with the fact that you have to get these annotations, and these annotations could be related to sensitive attributes? For example, in the examples that Kiki gave, in a real world scenario, you don't want to ask people their gender when you are sensitive about making decisions that could discriminate based on gender. So how do you deal with scenarios where you are not allowed or you have very limited budgets to get annotations related to gender? And finally, we do some work on designing algorithms that can be used to fix bias in rank lists. I don't have time to talk about all of this, but I'll just give you an overview of this. And the second line of work that we do in my group that I think is very relevant in context of web is misinformation. Because especially in the case of web and social media, misinformation and bias go hand in hand. And I think that's an area that hasn't been much explored in the research community yet. So we need methods to find misinformation. And if we can find resources that present misinformation, they are also likely to present more biased results. So we can incorporate this information from misinformation detection to identify potential bias and to potentially fix for the bias. So these are the two separate lines of work that we try to approach in my research group. So first, I'll briefly talk about bias in search engine results. So as you know, we use search engines in our everyday lives as a primary tool to access information. And it could have a very big effect in society. And if the search engine results are biased in one way versus another, it could affect how people relate to others, how they evaluate their own opportunities and decisions. So that's one area that's very important. And it's an area that people hasn't looked too much into. It's a relatively new line of research in which people started looking into bias in search results. So for this, we need to design mechanisms, evaluation mechanisms to evaluate bias in search engine results. And we also need to develop algorithms to fix this bias. So I'll talk about some methods that we have developed for evaluating bias in search engine results. But one thing I would like to mention here is there is still no agreed upon metric. And there are several metrics that's been proposed, and what I'll present is one of them. But it's such an open area that no one knows what the perfect metric is here. So here is some examples of bias in search results. I'm sure you're all aware of some of these examples, but in general, as you know, for example, some of the politicians like Trump recently made claims that some of the newspapers are always presenting biased results about them or his political party and things like that. So it's been in the news for quite some time now. And so given this, one question is, let's assume that you have a ranked list of results. How do you measure bias is one question. So first you have to identify a pivotal feature, like what do you consider, what feature do you want to look into? So it could be, for example, political bias in case of the previous example. It could be gender-based bias, it could be age-based bias. In search results, actually, you do see that bias is present in many different dimensions if you look at it in more detail. Then you have to design a tool that's capable of measuring the feature, like you can get annotations, for example, and you have to define a reference point. And this is a very difficult one to define. But what we mean by reference point is, what is the ideal proportion of results presented? Is it 50-50? But in lots of cases, this would depend on the collection itself, especially in the web. For example, if in your document collection, in your corpus, 80% of the documents are against conservatives and 20% is in favor of conservatives, what should be the optimal presentation in your top K results. This is not, it's not a solved problem. We make two assumptions at this point. One is it should be 50-50 equal presentation of both dimensions. The other one is it should be representative of the collection proportion. But again, it's a research problem that needs to be studied, and I think it's a problem that depends from one application to another, what the optimal reference result point should be. So given this, how do we measure bias? One application we studied is political bias in search results, just to see if some of the claims made by Trump were actually correct, essentially. So what we did is we identified 62 controversial points. There is this website, procon.org, that contains a list of controversial points, and it's being updated regularly. And we submitted these controversial queries to two major search engines. And we ran a crowdsourcing campaign to label these the top 10 documents retrieved by these two major search engines as liberal, neutral, conservative, and non-relevant. We actually don't care about the non-relevant parts because people wouldn't look at these results necessarily. But we mainly focus on getting the political dimension in these relevant results. So these are some of the example controversial topics that we have. It has things like, for example, abortion, Obamacare, minimum page. We try to identify these controversial topics in which people have political kind of perspective on them, basically. And then we devise several metrics to measure bias in rankings. Basically, the way we approach it is we assume that one class is positive. Let's assume that the conservative class is the positive one. Then we compute regular ranking evaluation, quality evaluation metrics, such as DCG or precision at K is the simplest one. And we compute the difference if we consider the conservative, for example, class as a positive class, minus the liberal class as a positive class. And we computed the differences between these two, and we compute the overall metric across all the queries. So this is what our results look like in these two engines. I don't want to name the engines themselves because I don't want to run into any problems about this. There are two major search engines that are commonly used, but our results show this quite interesting because it looks like the results presented by the search engines are indeed biased. And the two search engines, when they are biased, they tend to be biased in the same direction. So you can see that when the results are negative in one engine, the other also gets negative score regarding the metric that we discussed, and vice versa. One search engine one tends to be slightly more biased than the other one, but depending on the metric, there isn't too much significant difference between the two. So this is one interesting finding that we found, because we weren't sure if the claims made about this political bias in the results is true, but it looks like there is definite bias presented in search results, which is a bit concerning in the sense that it might have some effect in people's perspective to things. But again, what you define as bias could depend on the document collection, as I mentioned. So we can't really say that this is the problem caused by the ranking functions used by search engine companies. It could indeed be just a factor of the collection itself, and that's something we are looking into. And I don't have time to present this work, but we have also done some work in collaboration by some search engine companies by looking at their click logs, which showed us that apart from political bias, you can also see bias regarding demographics. So search engine results tend to favor or present better results that are likely to satisfy people coming from certain demographics as well. And this is actually affected by the user populations. If you have, for example, a search engine that is more commonly used by older generation, your search engine results, because search engine ranking function is using clicks by the users, your rank results will be more satisfactory towards older generation as well. So there is definite bias present in search results, and that's something that we are looking into at the moment. How do you fix for this bias? How do you correct for this bias in rank results? So one other line, there are two other lines of work that's happening in my research group at this point that I will very briefly talk about. One is sampling techniques for reducing annotation effort to compute these fairness metrics. As you know, the results that I generated, it assumes that we know the political orientation of each document, if they are kind of conservative point of view or liberal point of view, but that requires significant amount of annotation. And these attributes are quite difficult to get because they tend to be sensitive as well. So how do you evaluate, how do you come up with these evaluation metrics without the need for annotating all the results by one by one? And that's something that we are looking into at the moment in collaboration with some other researchers from Microsoft. And we have come up with sampling techniques for reducing annotation effort. And our results show that just by using 10% of all the annotations that you would have to use, it is possible to come up with unbiased estimate of some of the fairness metrics, and evaluate these results in an accurate way. I'm not going to present these results here, but just to give you an idea about the line of research that we are working on in our group. And another line of work that we have done is now that we can evaluate bias, how do we fix for the bias? And we have developed a randomized algorithm to optimize for fairness in context of classification. And we are considering extending it to ranking case as well at this point. And our algorithm is guaranteed to result in optimal results in terms of metrics such as statistical parity. Again, I'm not going to talk about this metric at this point, but statistical parity is a metric that's commonly used in context of fairness. I guess Kiki briefly mentioned about parity as well. So this is one line of work that we have been doing regarding bias on its own. But as I mentioned, bias and misinformation, they go hand in hand in the case of web. And misinformation is basically a major problem in context of web, in context of search engine results, as well as in social media. And if you kind of do the research on it, you will see that resources that present biased information are more likely also to present incorrect information that is not necessarily true. And vice versa, resources that present incorrect information are also more likely to present biased results in context of web. So when you do research about bias, you have to consider misinformation hand in hand with that. And I think misinformation detection methods could be very valuable and very helpful in helping deal with bias present in the web. So given this, we have done different lines of research to identify misinformation available in the web, and we have developed several algorithms for automated fact checking, and where the goal is given a claim or given a news article, for example, can you classify this claim as true or false, and potentially unverified, because you can't always verify the claim. So we have developed two methods in this context. One of them is the integration of a claim and its auxiliary evidence. So given a claim in social media, for example, or in news, people usually write comments under this claim. And the way people respond to these claims is very informative about the truthfulness of the claim. So we have developed a method that can help identify the truthfulness of the claim by using people's responses to the claim made. And another line of work that we have done is on stance detection, where given a claim, or again, a news article again, we basically use retrieval techniques to retrieve documents that are related to this claim. They are not necessarily supporting the claim. They can actually be disagreeing with the claim. But first, you identify all the relevant documents that talk about the claim. And then by using content of these documents, you can identify, is this document supporting the claim? Is it disagreeing with the claim? And by aggregating all these resources, you can then infer, is this claim correct or not? So these are the two lines of work that we have done. I'm going to be very brief on this because I know we don't have too much time. But basically, one line of work that we have done is to use a deep learning architecture in order to form a representation of the claim and form a prior belief as to whether the claim is correct or not, and then to form a representation of the replies by the users, so that you update the initial prior belief about the correctness of the claim by using this representation or information you get from people's replies. And if you look at the results in the paper, we were able to achieve the best performance in fake news challenge by using this method. And another line of work that we have done on stance detection again, where we looked into developing a hierarchical architecture. Again, I will be very quick here. We developed a hierarchical architecture that first identified a bunch of, given a big collection, identify the documents that are relevant to the claim, and then within those relevant documents, identify if they support, if they agree with the claim, disagree with the claim, or they just discuss about the claim, but they don't have particular stance about the claim. The power of this architecture comes from the fact that it's hierarchical, so that it can deal with a very large class imbalance problem, because as you know, in the web, there are very large number of non-relevant documents, but very small number of relevant documents. So the hierarchical nature of this this particular infrastructure was quite useful in deal with this class imbalance problem, through which we were able to get very good performance. So again, I don't want to take too much time. I try to give an overall summary of the research work that we have been doing regarding bias and misinformation. So I have talked about evaluation of bias in context of ranking, in particular in search results. And two lines of work that I didn't have time to talk about, and these two lines of work are currently being prepared for submission, is the sampling techniques that we have built to evaluate bias in search results or in rankings with limited annotations, and randomized algorithm to fix bias results. And we have shown that you can optimize for example, you can get best statistical parity by using these randomized algorithms. I have also briefly talked about the importance of considering misinformation when you look for biased information in context of web, because it's something that people hasn't addressed much. And I mentioned that misinformation and bias go hand in hand in case of web. And I have very briefly talked about two different lines of work that we have done in order to find misinformation in context of the web. And as the next step, what we are looking into is to incorporate our automatic misinformation detection methods in order to help identify biased resources in the web. So that's a quick summary of the work that we do. It's not just myself, it's done with a bunch of people, and I would like to thank all of them for the work that they have been doing. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Emine. Yeah, can you just stop sharing the screen? Just yep. It's perfect. Yeah, I think the first question that comes on my mind. There's several questions, in fact, so maybe I should not ask some of them right now. But I guess you can definitely create a score, I suppose, for different search engines. You know, you have Bing, you have Google, Yahoo, and you know, and also the other ones in the kind of, you know, at the Guardian website and Daily Mail. Each one have their own. Have you, in a way, I guess you probably have tried to do that, and it's probably kind of anonymous information. But is that possible? Is that something that can be done?
Yes, that's one thing we have looked into exactly, and the challenge with that is actually, if you go back even before bias, there's been so much work on evaluating relevance of results, the quality of search engines, and right now there are more than hundreds of metrics that people use to evaluate search results. They don't necessarily agree with each other, but they are mostly correlated. And that's where we are in context of measuring bias in ranked lists as well. There is no agreed upon metric at this point. There are all these proposals, and there are some metrics that in context of classification, for example, researchers have proved that if you optimize for one, you are guaranteed to actually get worse performance in the other. So they don't 100% correlate with each other. But we are at this point where we are just looking into developing the metrics, and I think in the next few years there will be more agreement as to which metrics to be used. But especially in context of rankings, because research and ranking, it's a more challenging problem than classification. Because in context of rankings, there is also this issue that people are presented with the top results more often than the bottom results. So how do you incorporate the fact that top results are more visible than the other ones? So you need some top-heavy metric, and how do you weight these results differently and so on? These are very difficult to address, but we are, in the next few years, I think we will have some more agreed upon metrics related to this.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask something related? Do you think that, I mean, I think the political bias one is very difficult, even your system, that it's like it's liberal or it's more to the right, there's probably more a continuum on both, and you want to kind of avoid extremism. But I think the misinformation is almost one where I think it's more neutral. Do you think that they would at some point try and have an industry standard for the level of misinformation that's admissible, let's say?
I think so. I mean, industry already started looking into these, right? Like Facebook have all these they have their own annotators, and journalists, again, there are journalists annotating things for misinformation. I don't think there is this threshold of like tolerable misinformation, but the goal is to basically eliminate it as much as you can. And it's also interesting because it depends a bit on the provider. Certain providers in online, they just say, okay, we are not responsible for the misinformation that's present. It just comes from resources. We just present whatever is available in the corpus, so it's not our fault. So it depends a bit on the perspective of the people, but I think in the future there will definitely be more regulations related to this.
Yeah, just a question from the audience. I guess the person would like to ask the question that I tried to ask, but I felt embarrassed. So someone asked the question, what is the less biased search engine over there? It's difficult, I know, because there's like thousands of metrics, but someone will ask that question.
We shouldn't answer this question just because I work very closely with these companies. I get data and stuff, so I'll try to avoid. And in the paper, again, we try to avoid revealing anything related to individual company. Yeah. So, but they both tend to be kind of the bias in there, as the results show. They tend to be correlated.
And the bias is usually, yeah. And I guess, I mean, the question is, the bias is usually, as you said, it could be because of the information that they have, or it could be because people are searching more, those kinds of things. It really,
exactly.
But I guess Google is so plural in a way, like people just use Google most of the time. It's just so dominant to some extent, right?
Potentially, but still you would see different, if you look at demographical information, different search companies to get different kind of proportion. And if, let's assume that if one age group uses the search engine more than other, again, your results may be affected, or one political perspective, for example, the results may be affected by that.
Yeah, yeah. There's a question, I guess, for you both. So someone asked the question, how do you make it's a complicated question. How do you make the trade-off between group fairness, like statistical parity, etc., and individual fairness? I guess they're kind of difficult to conciliate, right? You have to kind of opt for one when you start the conversation, right? You can't put both together, or is it possible? That's a question for you.
I think in the selection context, it goes back to what I said about the funnel. So the algorithm is never perfectly accurate, and we have false negatives and false positives in there. What we want to avoid from the recruiter's perspective is you want to avoid false positives. So you don't want to have someone in there that looks really good, but actually isn't a good candidate. But what we're more willing to accept is losing some good candidates, right? So as long selfishly, from the recruiter's perspective, as long as I end up with enough good candidates, it's not as bad for me to lose some good candidates on the way. But obviously, there's an imbalance with individual fairness, because that is unfair to the good candidates that were wrongly excluded from the application process. But I think in recruitment, as long as those good candidates aren't consistently from one protected group, right? Gender, ethnicity, etc., then that's a trade-off you have to accept. And I don't think it's the most terrible trade-off either, because it's still a job application. You can apply for other jobs as well. Obviously, if the outcome was something like the justice system or allocating medical help or whatever, then you'd have to be a lot more careful. But I think as long as those individuals don't get excluded because they belong to a certain group, or they consistently get excluded across all algorithms, then it's not so problematic. And we have mechanisms also to help those individuals. So say if you have specific disabilities that might affect how the algorithm works, there's routes, especially under GDPR, where you can request being assessed by something other than the algorithm. So there are some routes, but yeah, it is a trade-off. I think it really depends on the area of application, what your threshold is for accepting it. Yeah.
Yeah, my answer would be very similar to Kiki. It depends on the application. So especially because we work on machine learning, we kind of treat it as, okay, let's assume that we care for group fairness, then video optimization, or we care for individual fairness. And we develop method assuming that we focus on one metric versus the other. And that's why I think especially this area is it's very important for like machine learning researchers to work together with people who work directly on the application area and humanities as well. So it's very important that we come up with these methods all together. Otherwise, we will just say, okay, let's care about this metric and we optimize for it.
Yeah, I know that I'm conscious of time, and I just want to ask a last question, which is more like a kind of, it's almost like a moonshot question. If you could change something, or if you could make a decisive intervention, it could be on the bias or misinformation, etc. You'd like to change something or put something in law, or or start a movement. What would be the key thing that you feel is missing in your space? Kiki mentioned about the regulation, the things that she would like to change. But apart from this rules and stuff, like law, etc., what would be the key thing? Is more public attention? Is more media attention? Is more research? What would be the key thing that you feel would kind of revolutionize the space that you are working on?
One thing that I would like to see is actually, again, regulations, but in the sense that I would force all these people who use AI for decision making to report how biased their results are, and to make that public. And because I see that, especially in the industry, and that's one question that I try to ask Kiki as well. They try to avoid this bias issue because it opens up a very big problem for them potentially. For example, they try to avoid evaluating if their results are biased at all, just so they don't see that, and once they avoid it, it doesn't exist. But if you force them to report these numbers, then they will start thinking about fixing bias, and in the future, I think that will be very important so that we have a fair society.
Yeah, and I think the recruitment equivalent would be to do that at the hiring level as well. So for companies to show who they hire and how diverse their hiring outcomes are, because the algorithms in that context are still advice only, and the decision in the end gets made by a recruiter. And you can have an algorithm that's perfect in terms of bias, and then you still end up with one demographic only being recruited.
Yeah. Excellent. On this last note, I really would like to thank Kiki and Emine for their fruitful participation and the insights provided. Special thanks for Emery, Kazin, for their coordination and content curation. Thanks for the UCL AI Center for sponsoring our activities. Please do subscribe to the UCL AI Center YouTube channel and Twitter page. We will be advertising the next event shortly, but it's planned for the 22nd of October. It's going to be on the topic of human-centric AI. Please do attend. And yeah, goodbye and see you soon.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.